Hello to Nairobi, hello to Bonn. It's nice being back here. Some of you I've seen before in seminars during my time at this institute. I work now at the Import Promotion Desk, it's so-called. It's a development project where we try to help get small and medium-sized enterprises from the Global South access to the European market. And I'm responsible there for the cut flower sector, which means I support smaller farms from Ecuador, Colombia and Kenya, very recently also from Kenya, to get access to the European market. And before I did that, as Detlef already said, I worked quite some time, actually 6 years, on a research project on the cut flower industry at Lake Naivasha and its linkages to the European market. And I want to give you some insights on what has happened on the European market and how it relates to Lake Naivasha, where you'll be spending some time. Please feel free to ask questions afterwards. So what has happened? I briefly want to start what has happened on the European side of the cut flower industry is that new consumption patterns came up. For a long time, what we have seen is that flowers were sold in classic florist shops. They were sold per stem, quite high value, so you pay maybe 2, 3, 4 euros for one rose. What came up over the past 25 years, more and more, is what you can see here, is flowers being sold at supermarkets for a lot cheaper. You can buy now maybe 14 roses for 1.99 at Aldi, fair trade labeled. You can buy them at petrol station, at garden centers. You can buy them in normal supermarkets. So this is one of the mega trends in the consumption patterns of cut flowers in the European market. At the same time, what we have seen in Lake Naivasha, and maybe you've already seen this, you can see huge dynamics in the socio-ecological system, and you can actually see this on satellite pictures. This is Lake Naivasha. I hope it plays out. What you can see in dark blue down here on the bottom is a flower farm. Everything that's red, especially here, is our settlements. So this is Naivasha town, where I think you'll also be staying. So this is the 1980s. You see only one flower farm there. You hardly see the settlements. In the 90s, there were already more flower farms coming up in the south of the lake. Settlements are growing. 2011, even more. The blue is changing a bit to a lighter blue. And 2015, what we have seen is basically all the south of the lake, and you will be seeing this in Naivasha as well, is covered by flower farms. Lake Naivasha town has basically, I think, grown tenfold. You have a huge settlement on the eastern side on the lake, and nowadays you have even more flower farms coming up here, which is quite a remote area west of the lake. So we see huge social ecological dynamics in Naivasha, and at the same time we see that are related to cut flower industry, because you can see the size of flower farms growing here. They reflect in blue because they're all in greenhouses. I will talk about that later a bit. And what I want to talk about a bit today is how these two dynamics relate to each other. So we have on the one hand market entry of corporate retail chains in Europe, all over Europe, and we have the cut flower industry at Lake Naivasha and a highly dynamic social ecological system. So what do these two processes have to do with each other? That's what I want to talk about in the next 15 to 20 minutes maybe. So first of all, I want to take a step back and talk shortly about what has happened on a global scale in cut flower production and trade. What we have seen over the past, beginning in the 1970s, 1980s, is the shift of production from the centers of production, centers of consumption, which are in the global north. So they are in Germany by capita consumption, the biggest consumer of cut flowers in the world. We have other huge consuming countries, also the United States. And historically, flowers have been grown to the consumption center. So you have flower growing areas around here at the Niederrhein, Lower Rhine area. You have flower growing areas in the Netherlands. You also had huge flower farm growing areas in the United States. What we have seen over the past 20 years especially is a shift of production to the global south. And global south especially means countries around the equator with areas that have an altitude, because flowers grow and they need a lot of insulation from the sun, but they can't stand too high temperatures. So what is perfect is something like Lake Naivasha, where you're at 2,000 meters above the sea level, but you're close to the equator. Other countries typical for growing cut flowers are Ethiopia, Ecuador and Colombia, and you could see a rise of flower exports from these origins to Europe over the last 20 years. The growth for Ecuador and Colombia would be higher if we would show the exports to the United States, because these are their main markets. So first of all, we have a shift of production to the global south. And the other thing I have already told you a bit about is that we have the rise of so-called supermarket bouquets. So now flowers are sold more and more in supermarkets. Number is rising, the shares are rising of supermarket sales, and it's also changed the way how flowers are sold. I'd already told that a bit. Previously, flowers were sold as single stems. There was a florist who would arrange a bouquet for you, and you would pay for a single stem. Now you just buy a pre-packed bouquet, which is considerably cheaper. Here we have an advertisement from Lidl, which is $3.99. Prices have gone down a lot in the last 3 years, so now you pay maybe 14 roses. These are small roses. At Aldi, as I said, $1.99. And they're all certified. So these, for example, have a fair trade certification, they have a Global Gap certification, they have a Rainforest Alliance certification, whereas flowers in florist shops, they usually don't have a certification, or at least none that you could see in the shop. So a lot of things have changed on the market. We can see this in numbers as well. It depends a bit on the country you're in. United Kingdom, for example, sells over 60% nowadays already in supermarkets or discounters, which is here unspecialized retail, so this is non-florist shops. Germany is still a classical market for florists, so nowadays these are numbers from 2016. Nowadays we're around 40% of flower sales are still in florist shops, but it means the number of supermarket or unspecialized retail sales has also grown significantly, and it's growing all over Europe. So this value chain is increasing its importance in the market, in the cut flower markets over the last years. Talking about what has happened on the flower market, in the global flower market, we have to talk a bit about the Netherlands, because the Netherlands historically have been the biggest production center in Europe for cut flowers, and they kept their pivotal role in the industry by shifting to a trade center. There's a lot of government politics involved in that. There are a lot of huge companies involved in that. There's a lot of knowledge involved in that. There's a lot of personal networks and informal knowledge involved in that. But the main outcome is that the Netherlands have been the most important place in the global cut flower industry, and they still are. Although production decreased significantly. So nowadays there are roughly estimated 140 hectares of rose production left in the Netherlands from around 900 hectares 20 years ago. And with rising gas prices, this will probably come down to 80 hectares by the end of the year. So importance in production is decreasing, but the importance in the industry is basically still the same. You have huge places there selling flowers. The industry up today is Royal Flora Holland. This is a grower cooperative, so it's owned by growers around the world, and they auction their flowers. So historically, most of the flowers have been auctioned. They haven't been sold directly with contracts. They have been auctioned to buyers. So you put your flowers on an auction, you don't know what price you will get, and somebody who's willing to pay a certain price for them buys them via the auction. This was historically the most important way how flowers would come to you. So they were sold over auctions. There are a lot of actors missing in that. This is very simplified, but the most important thing is they were sold via auctions, mostly to importing companies who then traded them to wholesalers, who then traded them to florists, who then sold them to consumers. What has happened with the market entrance of retail chains is that now importers who buy in the name of supermarkets go directly to flower farms in the global south, in Kenya for example, buy their flowers directly, sell them directly to supermarkets, and supermarkets then sell them to consumers. And this has grown in importance a lot over the last years. Direct sales have now outnumbered auction sales. These are numbers from Flora Holland. So this is only through one company. If you look at the overall picture, the picture would even be clearer. Direct sales now outnumber auction sales by a lot already. This had not only changed the way flowers are sold, but it also has a lot of implication, for example, on the governance of value chains. How value chains are regulated, for example. What has grown also in importance, I already hinted that beforehand, is these labels, these certificates, like Fair Trade that you probably know. There's MPS, which is a cut flower specific certificate, Rainforest Alliance, but there are dozens of them. I think the estimate is right now there are around 60 only for cut flowers of them. In auction sales, these hardly play any role because there's no stable link between buyers, consumers, florists, and the growers. And standards are not, certificates are not displayed even on the auction, so these didn't play a role. With the emergence of direct sales, these standards became more and more important over the last years. What has also changed is, I already hinted that the consumer prices have declined, but also the prices for growers have been stable, but in the absolute price, but they have been going down in real price over the last year. So in the top half you can see the absolute price, and in the lower part you can see the real price without the inflation. So you see real price has been stable or going down over the past 10 years. This is only up to 2017, so if you would follow that trend up to now, this would be even more drastic, the change. So we have lower prices, more standards, which also means more costs for the producer because you have to pay fees to get an audit from an auditing body. You have to pay to change your production processes, so higher costs for you. Obviously also energy prices rose, transport prices rose, but real prices were going down. So this is, in a nutshell, what has happened in the global market. So we can depict it as a new market order, so to say, rise of supermarket bouquets, production has been globalized, market encounters, new market encounters arose, and prices have been low over the last years. How does that relate to Lake Naivasha now? As I said already, around Lake Naivasha, we have a lot of flower farms. It's now one of the biggest production centers worldwide for cut flowers. With a historic start in the 1960s, we have around 50 farms immediately around the lake. If you go up the hills to Kenyan, which is a bit further, you will see that there are dozens more farms, but the big farms are all around the lake. They employ roughly 40,000 laborers, and Lake Naivasha accounts for roughly around 70% of Kenyan flower exports. What's important to understand, you will also see that, is that flowers are grown, let's say roses, let's talk about roses here. Roses are grown 95% under greenhouses. They're grown on middle to large scale farms, so most of these farms growing flowers are larger than 20 hectares. So these are not small producers, these are large companies. They can have up to 250 hectares. There were flower farms, they were struggling over the last years, that produced up to 1.5 million roses per day, each day of the year. So this sums up to around 500 million roses a year for one flower farm. So these are bigger farms producing, and these large farms are in the top management and also in the shareholders, often dominated by foreigners. So you can see a lot of Dutch capital and also Dutch knowledge there. So Dutch companies mainly not investing, but opening branches of their Dutch companies in the Netherlands to produce for their Dutch companies. Dutch managers that are in top management can also see a lot of British capital around Lake Naivasha. This is a bit to give you a rough idea of the situation right now at Lake Naivasha. What do flower farms do to be able to grow in this new market orders? First of all, we have to say that low prices with at the same time rising costs have led to financial precariousness. So these are large farms with 800, 2,000, 5,000 employees, but they are struggling financially. I think this quote sums it up very well. Farmers have a lot of assets, a little in the pocket and nothing on the bank. So farmers usually, they pay everything from what they get out of their daily business, from their daily turnover. This is important looking at all these numbers. You don't have to understand all of them. What's important here is marked in red, is that initial investments to set up a flower farms are very high. Nowadays, 100,000 euros is probably not realistic anymore. You're rather towards 200 or 300,000 euros per hectare. So if you have 40 hectares of a flower farm, you have invested around 10 million euros already in your flower farm before producing a single stem. Then you have production costs between 4 and 7 cents per stem per rose, which labor only accounts for 1.5 cents or 2 cents, which is very little in the end. And for sales and transport, you have costs of around 5 to 7 cents. With the average price for cut flowers at Flora Holland, we are now at 22 cents, but this includes high-value stems from Ecuador, which sell for a lot higher prices than everything that comes from Kenya. You have 22 cents average price for roses. For prices for Lake Naivasha roses are between 10 to 15 cents. And if you look now at these numbers that add up to maximum 14 cents already, and these are numbers from like 3 to 4 years ago. So energy costs now a lot higher, transport costs a lot higher, you're much higher here. So you're coping with typical margins for growers, for companies of 0 to 5%, which is basically nothing. Like you have to be a very good company to be able to cope with these prices. So financial precariousness has already been there before COVID hit all the farms and all the struggles we have seen over the last 3 years. How do farms cope with these prices? First of all, they expand their farms. If you have 2% of a margin of a profit margin, you have to produce a certain minimum amount of flowers to be able to produce any profit in absolute terms. So you increase your production. Production has been increased a lot over the last years. You could see this on the pictures. At the same time, flexibility also has been growing. So flower farms try to sell through different market outlets. They don't go only via the auction or one supermarket. They try to sell to everybody. This is how they have been trying to cope with low prices. What do profitable farms do is they innovate. Flower farming is highly technical by now. You have a closed environment. You are in a greenhouse. You can have hydroponics, which is artificial soil basically. So you basically try to tame nature because you're always dependent on weather. I have certain growing cycles, so I know this cut flower variety will produce in 12 weeks. But this is accounting for a specific weather data. And in order to minimize my risk, I have to be able to control my production as good as possible. So what good farms do is they try to invest a lot in technology to be able to control their production better. How do they do this? For example, hydroponic. You can see this in white here. This is artificial soil. This is usually made out of coconuts in which the flowers are grown. You have fertigation, which is a combination of drip irrigation. You can see the pipes here. This is drip irrigation with fertilizer. So you can digitally, with algorithms, calculate how much water, how much fertilizer each plant needs, and then you pump it just through your systems. And then, for example, very innovative farms, they have what you can see here in gray as well. This pipe, this is a heating system which is solar powered, trying to minimize the amount of time flowers are exposed to low temperatures at night, which usually increases your yield as well. So a lot of innovative techniques, and farms that don't use the techniques, they were struggling over the last years. What implication does this have for labor? As I said, flower farms are reliant on a lot of so-called unskilled labor. So these are not people who have a formal education, but in the end it turns out that a flower farm worker, a good flower farm worker, actually needs to be quite skilled because working with flowers is a quite delicate task. You need to know when to cut the flowers, you need to know how to fertilize them, you need to know how to pack flowers in the right way, and you need to work fast under hard conditions. When you go into a greenhouse, you might see that in Naivasha, it's hot in there. In the packing house, it's very cool in there because they're cooled down. So you need to be skilled, you need to work very delicately under hard conditions. What has happened over the last years is that we see ambiguous effects. On the one hand, we saw a lot of rises in the wage levels. So there's a CBA, a collective bargaining agreement, Tarifvertrag, kurz auf Deutsch, which has been renewed every 2 years, with quite good results for workers actually. Wages are still way below living wage levels, but they have been rising over the last years. And what we have seen as well is more stability over cut flower sales. You don't have to understand everything that says this graph, but what is important is the lower the level here, the higher the stability of flower sales over the year. Earlier, flowers were mainly sold during the peak season of the flower industry, which is everything between Christmas and Easter. And right now, flowers were hardly sold anywhere in the world. So what did flower farms do? They just hired seasonal workers and let them off in the low season. With supermarket sales, they sell year-round. They were able to maintain a higher stability also in the workforce. So this was actually quite positive for the flower farms work in the end, because they could have been hired by the flower farms over the whole year. What does this have to do now with the socio-ecological system at Lake Naivasha? I said there are 50 farms around Lake Naivasha. It's roughly around 2,500 hectares of production surface area. So this has a huge impact on the socio-ecological system. When we look at resource uses, we can see it has become more efficient because there's a lot of technology involved, which I said already. I showed you the technology, which also led to more efficient water use, for example. But in the end, we had a huge expansion of the industry. So in the end, it became more efficient, but it still became more in absolute terms. So we have intensified use of resources. What has happened on the other hand is that there's a very complex institutional framework. So there are thousands of regulations how to use the water system. A lot of them also sparked by development cooperation projects. Especially Dutch projects have been highly active there. A lot of them also sparked by private initiatives. A lot of German supermarkets, for example, they have had an interest in countering negative reports from Kenya. So they got active in trying to set up an institutional framework. So there's a huge institutional framework with a lot of regulations, a lot of rules, but they are highly inefficient because they they usually don't target the right actors. For example, the cut flower farms, they have a maximum amount they pay for their maximum amount of water they can extract from the lake, but the prices are so low that in the end they just pay double the price, so they have the double of amount they usually use, and it doesn't matter if the water abstraction limits get reduced for them. This is just a very brief example. Another trend that we see is that the flower industry gets involved a lot in discourses. There are a lot of media reports like this. If you have Googled Lake Naivasha before, especially in the European media, you've probably come across these reports. Lake Naivasha is dying. There are hundreds of them, like here, also in the German press, usually before Valentine's Day or Mother's Day. And in order to counter these reports, what has happened is especially that players from all around the industry, so German supermarkets, traders from the Netherlands, but also the big flower farms at Lake Naivasha, they became more and more active in trying to control these discourses, for example, by getting a lot of certifications, because then they can show, hey, look, this is not true. We have 15 certifications that show that we produce our flowers sustainably. And lastly, what in my opinion is probably the most severe impact on the social ecological system of Lake Naivasha are more indirect effects. Lake Naivasha has grown, the group in Nairobi knows this, from a small town place, from a very rural area into a highly populated area. A lot of inner Kenyan migrants have moved to Naivasha in search for work, for labor, and as you can see here, the population has quadrupled over the last 30 years. The problem or thing here is that this region was not prepared for this. A huge share of flower farm workers live in informal settlements, which means there's no public infrastructure, there's no sewage system, there's no public education system that is suitable for these many people. and this actually usually affects, for example, the lake a lot more than the direct affluence from the flower farms. For example, that there's no sewage system in these settlements where a few 100,000 people lives. Summing this up a bit is, what I wanted to show you is that there's not one causal effect that the market dynamics or the new market order in the cut flow industry has had on Lake Naivasha. It's very ambiguous, it's very ambivalent. There are a lot of different, also sometimes contradictory dynamics at Lake Naivasha that relate to the cut flow industry. And the best representation for this is usually the lake level of Lake Naivasha. Over decades, there were scenarios which said, okay, the lake is drying out, the cut flow industry is responsible for that. And suddenly what we have seen over the last years is a huge rise in the lake levels. This is only up to 2013. Right now the lake, especially 2 years ago, it was even much higher. So all these discourses, they cannot be broken down so easily, and it's usually not that very monocausal, easy relation between one process on the one side and one process in the social ecological system on the other side. To put this on a more meta level maybe is, usually as it is depicted is, we have one thing happening on the global market. So we have the rise of discounter roses in Germany, let's say. And this has a causal effect on what is happening in Lake Naivasha. But usually it's not that easy. It's rather Lake Naivasha being part of this global market dynamic. It's flower farms that are able to produce flowers for 15 cents, which only makes it possible that a discounter in Germany can sell flowers for $1.99, 14 stems. It's a social ecological system that to a certain degree can withstand the pressure of 2,500 hectares of greenhouses growing flowers and still producing flowers for that price. It's workers moving to Naivasha, being able to cope with the salaries they have, that only enables discounters selling roses at this price. So this usual depiction of we have one trend in the global north, a global dynamic on the market, and then it goes top down, linear. I think it's not very right, or it's not that easy to say that this is happening in the cut flow industry. So it's rather flower farms, a social ecological system, being part of that global market order that enables this new market order to come into being and to be stable up to today. I haven't talked about the COVID situation at all, because most of this has happened over the last 10 years already, but I can talk about that a bit later if you ask me some questions about it, but I would leave it for that now.
Okay, thank you very much, Andreas. So it was the work of 5 years of research in 20 minutes, very good. And now it's your turn to ask your questions. You and also the ones, our friends in Nairobi. So if you have a question, Nairobi, do you want to start?
There is one question here.
Yeah?
There's somebody who's wondering that because there's a group that is doing a topic on waste management, and you made the point that perhaps population increase could be one of the leading causes of the socio-ecological transformation or changes. But is it quantifiable? Because compared to 250,000 hectares of land under flower farms, and of course a lot of noise that flower farms are the ones that are responsible for dumping waste into the lake. And now we bring this dynamic, this angle, that perhaps it is the population and the lack of proper sewage, etc. Do we have any quantifiable information? What is the biggest challenge, particularly when it relates to sanitation and issues related to pollution of the lake? Thank you.
So there are a lot of studies on that, especially of sewage from flower farms. The thing is, and I think that's the big difference between the flower farms and the settlements. Flower farms have the possibility to reuse their water and make a wastewater treatment. And actually more and more farms are doing that. They have a water treatment plant because, as I said, it's drip irrigation, it's hydroponic, so usually it's actually quite easy for a flower farm to set up a closed water cycle. So for them it would be possible. Not all of them are doing it, only the innovative farms. The problem is, and I think you know this, Eric, and if you go to Naivasha, to these informal settlements, and a lot of development projects, and also the Kenyan state has tried this, installing wastewater sewage systems in these settlements where 100,000 people live, with these people living there at the same time, is almost impossible, I'd said. So I think in the end, we have on the one hand an actor where it is possible, so it's also, I think, more legitimate to push them to do this, because it's not that hard actually. It's a question of investing in these systems. And on the other hand, we have the informal settlements where it is very, very difficult, close to impossible, I'd say, to install these water treatment systems.
What your perspective is on how flower farms have experienced the COVID-19 pandemic.
So to sum up for Kenya, because I think I repeated shortly, they were asking, their research will be dealing with the risks of different stakeholders in the cut flower industry, especially relating to COVID-19, that are not directly health related but indirect effects, as I understand it. And the question now, the first concrete question is what experience have been made during COVID for different stakeholders. So, good question. So at first there was a shock in the cut flower industry globally. First lockdown, a lot of flower farms all around the world, they stopped producing because there were no flights. Cut flowers are fresh produced, so they have to be flown out within 2 days, 3 days maybe. So if there are no flights, it's basically waste. So there was a shock for maybe 2 to 3 months. Especially also because in a lot of countries flower shops closed, so there was no possibility to buy flowers or to consume flowers in Europe. What we have seen then, especially 2020, has been basically the best year of the cut flower industry ever. Really ever. Why? It's a bit contradictory, but usually people consume more flowers in time of economic regression. Why? Because they are staying more at home. They want to have it nicely, so they buy flowers. And especially last year, people weren't able to travel. Especially in Europe, a lot of people still had money to spend because they were in their regular jobs, but they couldn't travel, so they didn't spend it on restaurants, they didn't spend it on trips, so they stayed at home, they want to have nicely, so sales were the highest ever. So all farms, usually if you were a good farm, you had your best year ever in 2021. What we see now is the opposite of it. So we're basically getting a lashback here because now people are traveling again, so they're spending less money on flowers, so the consumption has dropped. That's the first trend right now. Second trend right now is we have one market collapsing. Russia is a very important market for roses especially. Not so much for Kenyan roses, but a lot for South American roses. What happens, a lot of flowers are not shipped to Russia anymore, but are basically dumped on the European market. So there's a huge global overproduction of flowers, which reduces prices. Second trend. Third trend is we have a huge rise in transport costs. Gas prices have gone up, oil prices, gasoline prices. So flights have become a lot more expensive. Flowers are shipped 95% still by air. So prices have gone up for transport. There's an overproduction, which means prices, consumption prices have gone down. So now we are in a very tricky situation. I know Kenyan flower farms, especially fair trade farms, have already called for help because sales are so low. They, are very frightened of what is to come in the next month. That's what's happening right now, which is only indirectly related to COVID, I'd say. as I said at first, it had a very bad effect, especially for flower farm workers, because they were laid off in the first month of the pandemic, because they weren't sold any flowers. Then in 2021 we had the best year ever, as I said, but now we're going back to crisis. So the question is how flower farms are addressing these risks I just mentioned. Well, there are some things which you basically can't do anything about, which is transport costs, which is not good for you. What I've seen in the last month is that a lot of investments into expansion of production were put on hold, because people in the flower industry, they usually invest from their cash flows, from what they get from their daily turnover. And if you have lower daily turnover, you can't invest anymore in production expansion. So a lot of expansion projects have been put on hold. What could play off positively for flower farms in Kenya and also in South America is what I briefly mentioned in the beginning, that flower production in the Netherlands will drop significantly until the end of the year. Because you have to see flower farms in the Netherlands, they are heated year-round with gas, and there were actually flower farms that stopped production on the first day of the war, because it didn't pay off in the end. Just to give you a number, a flower farm in a 10-hectare flower farm in the Netherlands in 2 hours burns as much gas as a 4-person household over a year. So that's a lot of gas, and if you have double the price, basically you can shut down your production. So if production comes down by, let's say, 50% in the Netherlands, this might be a chance for companies in Kenya. Question was, who are the most important stakeholders in the flower industry, basically then. It depends a bit on what perspective you want to have mainly represented in your work, because you can go the top-down basically perspective. Then you start with management. Obviously, there's usually a management hierarchy that is the same in each farm. You have a general management, then you have a production management, and then you have a sales management, which is usually equally interesting if you want to look at links to markets. But then you obviously also have a lot of laborers, which is the by far biggest stakeholder group in the industry. I'd say 50,000 people or 40,000 people. They are organized, not all of them, but there are unions, for example. There are a lot of committees on flower farms. For example, if you're fair trade certified, you have a fair trade committee, which is elected by the members of the flower farm, by the laborers. So these are then representatives, and which usually are a good entry point. And there are also industry groups, which are interesting, which is on a national level, the Kenya Flower Council, but there's also on the regional level, the Lake Naivasha Growers Group, LNGG, which also represents a large part of the flower farms around the lake. So this is practical insight from 3 years of field work. It's very hard. I split my research into 3 or 4 stays in Kenya, and I spent basically my first complete stay, which were 3 months, into getting access to flower farms, because they have become very reluctant, so to say, flower farms, which has a lot to do with what they call the blame game, which I can understand in a way. I've shown you these partly very aggressive media reports. There were a lot of NGOs blaming the industry, which has had a positive effect, especially from 2005 to 2015, very positive effect on the industry. But of course, farm managers got tired of being blamed for an apocalypse that might not even happen at Lake Naivasha. So it's not easy. There are several entryways. What is usually good is getting access to personal networks, and I think that's true for all kind of empirical field work, especially Dutch flower farmers. It's not that they have like an official network, but they all know each other, they are friends with each other, they hang out at different places. That's how I got access. So I just got to know a few of them. I drank some beers with them. They saw I was friendly, I was nice, I wouldn't want to blame them. So then they introduced me to their friends, basically. Might be hard to get access within, I don't know how much time you have, probably not 3 months there. What you could also try is go through the official places, like I told you, Lake Naivasha Growers Group, Kenya Flower Council. They might have tips at hand or get you into a flower farm. So the question is if there's, because now we have a very wide perspective on the flower industry, if there's anybody from Kenya doing research with a more Kenyan perspective on the industry. There was researching, I don't know if you're still in contact with Maggie. Maggie Opondo wrote a series of articles. It's now almost 20 years ago, I think, so it's a long time ago. But she has been active afterwards, so I think she should still know. And there's, not too much, but there's a bit of research from Kenya, which is usually more, it's good master theses that have been published in articles. I could share some with you, I think, afterwards. And there are some articles, so yes, there is.
So what was the question again? Sorry.
For a more Kenyan perspective on the flower industry.
Or more Kenyan perspective?
So if there are Kenyan researchers, local researchers doing research on the cut flower industry.
All right.
I think that would be it for main questions, but maybe we could exchange contacts.
Yeah.
If there are any other comments or questions. Thank you very much.
Yeah, okay, thank you. So I would have a follow-up question to what they just asked. You said that one response of the flower farms to the crisis of the pandemic was just laying off workers. Were there other responses they had?
I mean, literally the problem was that you have running costs you cannot stop on a flower farm. So you have to irrigate your flowers daily. You have to fertilize them daily. So you have to buy fertilizer. You have to buy. You have to have your electricity running your water pumps and stuff like that. So you have a lot of running costs. So a lot of flower farms basically went into debt, and a lot of debt, because if there's no income coming, so as I said, these running costs are always paid through cash flow, what comes in daily, and they went into debt. But most of them, at least the ones I knew, they made up for the debt a year later when they had a record year in 2021. So that was, and actually some of them closed. I mean, you will see this at Lake Naivasha. There are some deserted flower farms around the lake, which are not all not all of them are related to the COVID pandemic situation, but some of them are.
Did you also observe that farms were, for example, spending less money on environmental protection?
Yes, on extra projects, I said, but usually on a good flower farms, environmental protection projects are incorporated in their daily production processes. If you have a water treatment plant, it runs, and if you have a good irrigation system, it's running. It's an initial investment cost. I think these projects were put on hold. If you were just investing in them, they were put on hold, obviously, for a few months. But usually, if it's a good flower farm, they use environmental projects to upgrade their production, lower costs for fertilizers, for example. So it's actually a plus if you have it once installed and you have made the initial investment.
I have a question from the side, Andreas. We are aware that the COVID pandemic was not the only crisis that the flower sector has faced. If you look at history, there is water fluctuations, lack of fertilizers, name it. And of course the clouds that, the volcano that erupted, and there was a huge cloud of dust that halted transportation, particularly flights that were coming to Europe. So there's quite a number of listed crises that the flower sector has encountered going back history. So the question here is, do you see a sense, of course you are not there during the pandemic, but also you are now more or less linked to what is happening, but do you see a sense of maybe flower farms changing or adopting new strategies that could help them to, deal with unforeseeable futures?
so a lot of them do. That's what I want to show a bit with that slide on flexibility. The flower industry is and has always been a very, very volatile business. So prices are fluctuating daily. There have been, I mean, now it's 38 degrees in Germany. Today, probably flower sales will be less than 1% of what they are in February. Nobody's buying roses today in Germany. So it's dependent on a lot of factors. So without even larger crises erupting, the flower industry is always prone to a lot of changes, daily changes, interruptions, insecurities. So what flower farms have been doing is try to be flexible in the way they sell flowers, especially. So direct sales has put a lot of pressure on them, but it's also helped them. And if you are good flower farms, they are able to navigate through different sales channels. So they have a certain part of their production they sell for a fixed price to a fixed buyer over the year. But then they also have spot sales where they make sense of peak prices during Valentine's Day, during Mother's Day. And by that way, they are able to mitigate risks. But these are not strategies that all flower farms are able to make use of. I think it's mainly management failure in that sense, because on the other hand, the flower industry is a very conservative industry. There are literally flower buyers in Germany that still write invoices with their hand. So it's very conservative. But new technologies will enable also a lot of to give flower farms more flexibility in the way they sell flowers, they ship flowers. Innovative farms are already using that, and that's why I try to show that innovative farms, they can reduce their insecurities in their risks in production, but also in their sales by having flexible strategies that account for insecurities or also that are unforeseen in the future. But on the other hand, you said this already, flower industry on a daily basis, but also on a long-term basis, they've always been prone to crisis and interruptions and unforeseeable things. So it's actually an industry that usually knows how to deal with these things.
Katharina?
Yes, thank you for your presentation. And I have a very general question. Do the different flower agencies in Naivasha, do they work together or are they competing?
They are competing. On the one hand, they are competitors, obviously, because they usually have the same target market, the same targeted buyers. But for example, what you can see is sales in between farms. So if one farm has an order placed by a supermarket and they lack flowers, they will buy it from another farms. There are also more and more farms at Lake Naivasha who produce bouquets, so ready-made bouquets, and you need a lot of different flowers for that. So you might produce roses, but you need gypsophilia, hypericum, other summer flowers for that, and then they will also buy from other flower farms. So you can see that, on the one hand, they are the main competitors for each other, but on the other hand, they're also collaborating, which is a very Dutch thing to do also, I think. And I'm working with a consultant in my current job, and he always says the Dutch will collaborate with their worst enemy if they just profit for 1 cent. And it kind of shows off because, yes, they are the biggest competitors because they are very similar in what they produce, but on the other hand, if they are in need, they will also sell to each other, for example.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Any more questions?
Yes, I have a question.
Yeah.
You said that some of the workers are being laid off during the low season. So do those workers have some kind of backup plan on how to survive or earn income during the season? During COVID, were those methods used and how effective were they?
What we see a lot is the biggest group of workers from Naivasha comes from the western counties in Kenya, and a lot of these people they basically go back home, so to say. So they go back to Western Kenya in low season. Some of them have side business at Lake Naivasha, so a lot of people we saw who are working on the flower farms, and in the afternoon they're selling in small shops veggies from a small shamba they have to top up their income, and they will increase that during low season. But as I said, seasonal labor has become less of a problem or phenomena in Naivasha due to stable sales year-round. Flower farms are able to also control that by, for example, giving the holidays during the low season in summer to their workers, or being able to navigate a bit easily to keep their workforce a bit flexible in the terms that they produce less in the summer or do maintenance work in the summer month, so people can stay in the farm without having to be laid off for the summer month. So the question was about certifications. If buyers asking for certifications have an impact, or a positive impact on the industry? Yes, certifications certainly have, to a certain extent, a positive impact on the industry, but I'd rather say they just represent the improvement that has been going on anyways. A lot has changed over the last 15 years. The problem now is, as I told you, there are like 60 certifications for flower farms, and the costs and the effort is on the producer. So you have to pay for your certificate, you have to pay for the audit. Obviously you have to do all the paperwork, because at first most certifications are a lot of paperwork, and nowadays there are farms holding up to 15 or 20 different certificates, because each buyer asks for a different certificate. So one day Rewe will come, they will ask you for Global Gap, Fair Trade, MPS and KFC Gold. And then next day Aldi will come, they might have their own certificate, they don't want that, they want Rainforest Alliance. So you need them to be able to cater all the needs of all buyers, and then your first certificate might change something in the way you produce your flowers. Even the second or third might change something, but the 7th, 8th or 9th certificate won't change a thing how you produce your flower. It will just give you another proof of that how you are producing, but you still have to pay for it. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. If there's no more questions, Eric, how is it in Nairobi? Is there more questions?
We are all set here. No more questions.
Yeah, okay, very good. Thank you. So to conclude once again, Andreas, thank you very much, first of all. So, thank you. Really very dense information, and I think the important take-home message now for the students is that we are preparing a field school in Naivasha. That means normally you have this idea, you go to a place which is, Naivasha is definitely not a remote place, definitely not. It's an industrial hub, and what you will see is that the changes in the ecology and the labor market and also the settlement pattern, you showed us the comparison of the satellite images. All these changes at the local level that we're observing there are deeply embedded in global entanglements. And that's something that is very typical for all processes that we name as globalization. Globalization is a very rough and very vague concept behind it. Here, and that's what we've seen in this study, you can actually trace the connections between the consumers in Germany, you as consumers, the supermarkets, the auctions, the licensing system, the owners of the flower farms, the organization of the farms in Naivasha, and then what is happening on the ground in Naivasha. So there are very intricate relationships between you and the people living in Naivasha. And that will be one of the objectives of what we are going to do in Naivasha in 2 months from now, that you're realizing how closely your life is connected to the life of the people you're working with. This may not always be very visible at first sight, but when you have the understanding of the relationship, it becomes more obvious. So thank you very much, Andreas. That was very very important insights we got through you, and I hope that some of this will come out when you're doing your studies in Naivasha. Okay, thank you very much, Eric, and bye-bye to the British Institute, our colleagues over there.